So we're ready for the Gospel of Luke. I want to read his introduction and then talk just a minute about Matthew and Mark again. So as we kind of lead into it, but I want to read Luke's introduction to his letter. These are very important to read and to understand. Sometimes when you're reading welcomes and all that, you don't have the information that you have here. So listen to what he says. He says, "For as much as the many have taken in hand to set forth in order a declaration of those things which are most surely believed among us." So he starts out and he says, well, he's telling you why he's going to write. He's going to write because he understands there's many that have taken and set forth and have written before the things that are surely believed among us. As much as he knows that, even as they delivered them unto us, which from the beginning were eyewitnesses and ministers of the word. Or he's referring to others before him like Mark and Matthew, and there's many other letters. But he's saying, I know all these are there. But in spite of that, he says, it seemed good to me also, having perfect understanding of all things from the very first, to write unto thee in order, most excellent Theophilus, that thou mightest know the certainty of those things wherein thou hast been instructed. Okay. So he's writing with the understanding and the knowledge of other writers. We know in reading Paul writing and asking late in his life for them to send, he wanted a coat and some of his letters, and Paul said, and send. You remember who he asked him to send? John Mark, right? John Mark wrote the Gospel of Mark. He says, send him to me because he would be very helpful to me. And he said, I'm here by myself except for, you remember who? Luke. So, gives the appearance that for Paul, quite possibly in prison, Luke is his personal physician. Luke is a doctor. Luke is with the Apostle Paul late in his life. When you read that verse and you understand, then he sends for John Mark, who wrote the Gospel of Mark. He comes, it's Paul, Mark, and Luke. So when he says, I have knowledge and understanding, he spent time talking to Mark. He works and does a ministry with Paul, and it is believed that Theophilus, no one knows who exactly that was, the name means excellent of God, or so most believe it's a man in Rome. And that Luke wrote, not just the Gospel of Luke, he writes the book of Acts, right? The Acts of what?
The Apostles.
Of the Apostles. Now, that's going to be in a couple of weeks, we're going to look at that, but I'm going to be clear with you tonight. It's not the Acts of the Apostles when you read it. It's really the Acts of who? Paul. I mean, it's all about Paul. He starts out and he's talking and, Peter and the council, and all of a sudden Paul's on the scene, and almost all the book goes on and on and on about Paul. So he kind of writes, he says, I'm going to write, I got perfect understanding from the beginning. And he starts in the beginning. He starts at the virgin birth, and he gives details, lots of details. When we do the Christmas story, we wouldn't have much Christmas story. We get none in Luke, we get none in Mark, and we get some in Matthew, but it's all, the beginning is all in Luke. So Luke says, I have perfect understanding, or I've taken time, he's saying, to study, to go to, and to talk to those that were eyewitnesses. It is believed that when you read this early account, and it is the account, it seems, of the birth of Jesus from Mary's perspective. He's talked to Mary. If you read Matthew, it seems like it comes from Joseph's perspective. So you have two accounts of different things, but it gives every appearance when you read this that he's done exactly what he said. Listen, I went to these people, I have dug up the details, I have took the time, years of time, to study. And even though others have written, and they're good writings and I understand them, I have knowledge from the very beginning in things that needs recorded. And so he begins with the story of John the Baptist and the birth of Jesus. He tells things in Luke that you won't get anywhere else. You want to know anything about Jesus at all? The only writings about him from his birth on, you got to read Luke. He talks about him when he's 12 years old. In the scripture, he talks about him growing up. And he said, listen, and growing up, he grew in stature, he said. And he grew in wisdom in the eyes of man and in the eyes of God. You won't find that written anywhere else. If you don't read the Gospel of Luke, you won't find that little bit of information about Jesus' life. Now you may, of course, we all just figure as a child he grew up and amazed people. And everybody loved Jesus growing up, right? All the teachers of the school thought he was the greatest. And he never got in trouble at home. But Luke gives us the only words. He talks about, him being left behind when his parents go. And he says, it's where you find out. Am I not to be about my Father's business? It's Luke hinting that at a very young age, Jesus understood exactly his course. And you get these details from Luke. Mark, I'm going to go through a little bit of this again. Okay, Mark is the first gospel written. He writes of Jesus' life, and he writes from the words of Peter. Peter is where Mark is getting the core of his information from. And there we talked the last couple of weeks that the reason Mark and the writers begin to write is that this vision that Jesus is going to come back really fast. And so 11 disciples can handle this job. The Great Commission is beginning to fade. They begin to understand they're getting older. Just speaking and orally going to church after church, each of them is not going to work. That they're beginning to be martyred. And the church is growing, and Jesus hasn't returned yet, so they continue. And Mark's the first one, and he begins to write. And Mark is a Jew, and he writes to the Romans. And he writes about what Jesus did. And so when you read in Mark, remember, I think it was 18 miracles we find. He is keen in on things that Jesus did. Matthew follows Mark. He's also a Jew. He's presenting Jesus to Jews, and he writes about what Jesus said. Remember, there's 6 big sermons all through Matthew when you read it. And instead of 18 miracles, while he records the miracles, there's the large number in Mark is 18 parables. So Mark showed us what Jesus did and the miracles. Matthew shows us what Jesus said and his sermons and his stories. So we got what he did and we got what he said. Now this is what we would want if we were searching or researching about someone's life. These are things we'd want to know. If I come and said, hey, do you know this guy? And one of the things, well, what did he do? Well, what did he say? That would be questions, right? So these two writers fulfill that writing. Luke has the understanding of these writers, and he's going to go a different direction, and he's different. Luke is a Gentile. He's not a Jew. And he's going to present Jesus as the Son of Man. He's going to present his human side for us all to see. It isn't just about what he did, and it isn't just about what he said. Luke, it's about what he did and what he said to whom. So Luke's all about the people in Jesus' life. There are just women alone. There are 10 women talked about in the Gospel of Luke that are not mentioned in any other gospel at all. 10. Because he's bringing out the fact of people. Luke wants you to know who Jesus talked to. And he wants you to know who he cared about and how he did that. So his stories, and he talks about the poor. Jesus hung out with the poor. Jesus hung out with, as you read, the tax collectors. Jesus talked and worked with, you'll find in his story, prostitutes. You'll find in his story, Samaritans multiple times. He will bring out that the one, remember the 10 cleansed of leprosy? Remember the one coming back? Luke details that. It was a Samaritan. He wants you to know it wasn't just one came back. The one that came back, Luke says, and wants to make clear the who of that is a Samaritan. He's trying to bring out the people that Jesus dealt with in his ministry. So you'll find that in his writing time and time again. So he wants you to understand Jesus' generosity, of his love, of his compassion. And so if you read Mark and Matthew, you would begin to think, hey, I've kind of got it together. And I want to present to you, until you read Luke, you don't got it together. Luke presents the people of Jesus' life and how he dealt one-on-one with individuals and groups. And it's special to see how he handled someone that was sick and hurting. And it doesn't surprise you that Luke, from the perspective of a doctor, as he researches and searches, constantly is bringing out facts and little details that matter. When Peter's mother-in-law is sick, you know what she's sick of? Not just a fever, a high fever, Dr. Luke says. Her fever. Me and you would say, hey, she had a fever. The doctor in Luke says he wants it clear. Her fever is not 99.9. It's 102 something. He wants you to know she had a high fever. He brings out those facts. There's things in Luke that if you don't read the Gospel of Luke, there are things that we would miss so much in our study of Jesus' life. Luke's divided in 3 sections. Luke 1 through 4, Luke writes about Jesus coming. It's about his birth. It's about him growing up. It takes you to his baptism. He gives a little detail of Jesus' baptism that I really hadn't caught before. It's kind of unique. When Jesus was baptized, we all know these facts, that It's the perfect picture of the Trinity. Because Jesus is in the water, right? The Spirit descends like a dove, and the Father speaks. So I think it's one of two occasions you really clearly see the Trinity. You see all three. I always just related Jesus being baptized, and don't get me wrong, that's key in this. But do you know what Jesus was doing? Luke tells us when the Spirit descended and God spoke. Was he just being baptized? Luke puts a key little thing. He was praying. While he was praying, the Spirit descended down and God spoke. And that's going to be a key thing if you follow through Luke that you'll find is Jesus off on the mountain, off by himself, off in this place, praying, praying, praying. After you finish chapter 4, chapter 5 through 21, you got Jesus coming, his birth, everything in the first 4 chapters. Then from 5 through 21, you got Jesus walking, teaching, living with people. And then 21 through 24, you got Jesus saving people. Or it's his death. So you got him coming to people in the first few chapters. Then the big bulk of the book is him walking with people. And then the last few chapters is him dying, resurrecting, saving people. That's the division if you want to divide it out as you read. Just taking a minute to try. Remember, our goal when we read and we do these studies is to make you want to read the book, to make you want to dig in. So hopefully last week you wanted, when we finished, to read Mark. So how do I make you want to read Luke if you just read Mark last week? Well, if you will turn with me to Luke chapter 15. Verse 11.
A lot of red letters in here, Pastor.
Yeah.
Nice song.
You didn't read this in Mark, so this might make you interested in reading Luke. You might find this of importance to you. You maybe have heard this before. You won't read it anywhere else in the Bible. It says, a certain man had 2 sons. The younger of them said to his father, Father, give me the portion of goods that falleth to me. And he divided unto them his living. Does anyone know the title we give this
Where you
story?
at?
Prodigal son.
Chapter 15 of Luke, verse 11. The prodigal son. It's only told in Luke. It's not in any other gospel. Did you know that? If you read all 3 gospels and you never read Luke, you wouldn't know there was a prodigal son. You'd never have heard that story. It's only recorded in Luke. It's a beautiful story, and if you put it all together with the other few chapters, there's a lot he's telling. So we all know that story of the prodigal son. Hey, something else about a tax collector you might not know if you didn't turn to Luke chapter 18. I think it's verse 11 too. All right. I got this right. Luke 18. That I got that verse. I wrote that down wrong. Is that kiss? That is a key verse, but I'm not going to. I want to go back to Luke 10, verse 25 is the other story that I wanted you to look at. right too? Yeah, I'm going to read a few verses to get to it. It says, "And behold, a certain lawyer stood up and tempted him, saying, Master, what shall I do and inherit eternal life? And he said unto them, What is written in the law? How readest thou? And he answered and said, Thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all thy heart, and with all thy soul, and with all thy strength, and with all thy mind, and thy neighbor as thyself." You probably thought Jesus said that, but actually the lawyer, Jesus asked him, he's the one that says this is what you should do. And Jesus said unto him, "Thou hast said right, this do, and thou shalt live." But he, willing to justify himself, said unto Jesus, "And who is my neighbor?" And Jesus answered, "A certain man went down from Jerusalem to Jericho and fell among thieves, and they stripped him of his raiment and wounded him and departed, leaving him half dead. And by chance there came down a certain priest that way, and when he saw him, he passed by on the other side. And likewise a Levite, when he was at the place, came and looked on him and passed by on the other side. But a certain Samaritan, as he journeyed, came where he was, and when he saw him, he had compassion on him, and went to him and bound up his wounds, pouring oil and wine, and set him on his own beast, and brought him to an inn, and took care of him. And on the morrow, when he departed, he took out 2 pence and gave them the host, and said unto him, Take care of him, and whatsoever thou spendest more, when I come again, I will repay thee. Which now of these 3 thinkest thou was thy neighbor unto him that fell among the thieves?" What's that story? The prodigal son, the good Samaritan, only in Luke. If you don't read Luke, you miss 2 of the main key stories that we relate our life around. We talk about our relationship with God. How many times have you heard a preacher or a Sunday school teacher talk to you about the prodigal son? Or even maybe your parents look and talk to you about the Good Samaritan. And this is a principle that we use that is famous throughout the world. And if you don't read Luke, if you just read Mark, and you just read Matthew, and you don't know these scriptures. Luke says, look, I looked and I researched, and I found these details, and I found these things that are important for you to read. And so he puts it together, and I present this to you tonight to say, listen, it's probably pretty common to accept, hey, I just read a gospel, so I read the story. And I'm trying to present to you tonight, no, you did not. You've read part of the story. Until you combine all 4 of them, you've not read the gospel. You've got one angle of it. Maybe you got what Jesus said. Maybe you've read and seen what Jesus did. But until you read the Gospel of Luke, you don't understand the people. And that's why you have the Son and the Samaritan. He's putting the people, the human side to it. That means you understand. If you want to do a devotion out of one of the Gospels, goodness gracious, get Luke out, because people's going to relate to it. You want to teach them something that they understand or you can relate? Don't go to Mark. Go to Luke. People relate to Luke because why? Because he presents Jesus with people, and from the human side as a man, even though he's God. And so we relate to Luke so well when we read it. It's so real to us. It touches our hearts. It was amazing when I was studying and getting ready to teach Mark last week. I kept thinking, man, Mark is so good. I just don't know how in the world you can get any better. He's so simple. And then miracles and everything, and then, and I just had that thought as I was preparing and thinking about it. It's so short, and I'm thinking, I just don't know why we don't read Mark all the time. And then I was working on Luke this week, and I'm going, oh, the Samaritan and the prodigal son. and relatable ways of telling things. He told the stories of how Jesus did these things with the people. You want the story of the little bitty guy that climbed up in the tree? Well, don't go to Matthew. You want Zacchaeus, the wee little guy? Got to get into Luke. That's where he is. He's up there. Luke's telling the story. Why? He relates all of the teachings to people. There's someone to go. And that's why when I tell you anything out of Luke, there's a title. Oh, that's the Good Samaritan. That's the prodigal son. Oh, that's the wee little guy. William wrote a song about him. Luke does, he writes in a way. It's different than other gospels. You want to go, it isn't the only gospel. You shouldn't just go home and say, okay, if I understand Fred's saying if I read Luke, I get it all. No, if you read Luke, you get this picture. But for goodness gracious, you want to know who Jesus was, right? What he did, not who he was, what he did. So you want to read Mark too. And you want to know what he said. So you want to read Matthew too. And so tonight, teaching is really trying to get you to understand that if you want the full picture, you can't just go read one gospel and get it. You must read them all, but you got to have an understanding of the writer. I want to kind of bring this to a close tonight in presenting how Luke quite possibly come about writing this gospel. We know he's trying to present the picture, and he's writing it from a human perspective, and he's highly educated, and he's hung out with the likes of Paul, and probably sat in a room with Mark, one of the early writers, if not Matthew too. Probably went and sat and spent time with Mary, the mother of Jesus. You read the genealogy, you read the facts about the birth of Jesus, only his mama would know. And so it's not recorded. He talks about the detail and how important, and he puts a lot of details there, and I think it's pretty obvious when you're reading. That's because he took time to research it. He probably went and talked to her. He sat down and he talked to her, and he got details that he wanted to record. And so he tells us things in such a fashion that every Christmas we call it the Nativity, and we put on bathrobes, and we get things, and we stand. God obviously chose him for a very special reason to write. But he didn't go, Luke, write all this down for the Gospel of Luke. Right. That isn't the way it worked. He didn't say that to Mark. Paul's letters weren't written to be, Paul didn't go, okay, I'm going to write Romans. That'll come right in there after Acts, probably. That isn't the thought pattern. He's writing this letter because God puts it on his heart for a purpose. He's writing to the Roman church. If you read Luke and you read his letter to the Gospel of Luke, and then you read Acts, and you listen to his relationship, and you relate him as the personal physician, quite possibly, who traveled with Paul. At one time, and I'll tell you this now, I don't forget where I was. One time, Paul gets snake bit. You remember that? And they all are sitting around waiting for him to die. They think he's going to die. You remember that story on that little island after the shipwreck and things, and he don't die? And if you read that in Acts, you know what he does? He's got other things to do, but he sends Dr. Luke. Luke goes in and doctors people into town. You're thinking, hey, Paul didn't fall dead. You mean you're sending Dr. Luke into town? So Luke is a physician. He's a doctor. He does, and even with the miracle worker and the power of Paul, his gift, his talent is used. And so there's this bond between those two. Paul does some things and Luke does some things, it appears. And in the end, it appears that Theophilus is some kind of official in Rome. Honorable Theophilus. We know Paul is imprisoned in Rome. It's quite possible when I read this and I think that God puts it on Luke's heart, and Luke writes these letters to Theophilus, and that's who he writes them to, in defense of Paul. He talks about the innocence of Jesus. If you read them, he's never talking about any difficulty with Rome. And when he gets into the Acts of the Apostles, we title it, he's talking about Paul's life. And by the way, if he did, it worked, because Paul is released from the Roman prison. But it's quite possible that his reasoning behind writing them was in defense of Paul. He's writing a defense. He's writing these letters that are a defense for Paul, not having any understanding, nor did any writer, that God was going to take these writings and form them and put them together, and people 2,000 years later would study to go, hey, Paul, you said you got perfect understanding of Jesus and his birth and his life. Let me see if I think you do. And I think if you'll read Luke, you'll probably come to the conclusion, you know what? I think he did. I think he did his study, he did his work, he did a wonderful job, and obviously the story of Jesus in the church and in our lives today without the Gospel of Luke would be sadly missing a piece. He tells a little story in the end, and after Jesus' resurrection, about the road of Emmaus. And he just appears to two guys after his resurrection. And I was looking through that, and because has anyone here ever been on an Emmaus walk? Know anyone's ever been on an Emmaus walk? So, yeah, I have. That's related to those two guys, you know. And that walk on that road to Emmaus, the whole thing is built around that story in the Gospel of Luke. And when you're reading it in Luke, he talks about on that road to Emmaus that there is two guys. One is Cleopas, and it doesn't name the other, and Jesus appears and talks to them. And I never really researched or really gave a lot of looking to see who got this name. Do we know who that guy actually was? We'll close with this. If you go to John's Gospel, John chapter 19, verse 25. So this is post-resurrection, okay? We know after his resurrection that Jesus appeared to the disciples, right? He appeared for 40 days and made several appearances. We know he appeared to his brother James. And that he would just appear out of nowhere. He would come through walls. We know there's odd things that he told Mary, don't touch me. Quickly after his resurrection, it appears days after, earlier rather than later. These two guys are walking along talking about Jesus' life and everything, and Jesus just kind of appears and is walking with them, and he hears them talking and they're sad, and he says, hey, what's going on? And they said to him, they go, what have you, I'm going to paraphrase, have you been in a hole somewhere? You don't know what happened in Jerusalem? You don't have no idea that they crucified Jesus, and tells them the story, and then they ask Jesus, and Jesus goes on and he reveals himself, and he disappears from them. Cleopas is one of those named, and but it don't really explain. But if you go to John chapter 19, let's see, did I get there? Verse 25. He's mentioned here, and we find out who he is. It says, now there stood by the cross of Jesus his mother. This is at the crucifixion. And his mother's sister, Mary, the wife of Cleopas, and Mary Magdalene. By the way, that's 3 Marys. There's a lot of Marys at the cross. I found that very special because that means Cleopas, and one of his post visitations was to his uncle. I've had very special uncles in my life that I cared a lot about. One, I got to go down, I drove 2.5 hours thinking I wouldn't get to the hospital until they told me his daughter said he probably won't be here when you get here, but he wants to see you. And I got to drive that 2.5 hours and pray and lead him to the Lord. And I had an uncle that was 30 years veteran in the Marines, was getting ready to do his 4th or 5th tour of Vietnam, and he quit. He said, I ain't going back. I had special relationships with those guys. So when I think of Jesus, and I think of growing up, and an uncle that had a very special effect in his life, and him traveling into Emmaus, and Jesus is resurrected, and he's sad. I find that special that Jesus appears to him. Again, in Luke's writing, I think he's trying to tell us that people are important to Jesus. Jesus looked at lives of individuals and he cared about them. Uncles meant something to him. People mattered. Whether you were a broken prostitute that's life was in total disarray, he had time for you. You was a Samaritan and no one else cared about you, and maybe you thought that he cared about you. And Luke presents that in a very special way. And I think for those in life that are struggling or down and wonder, does God love me? Does God care? Can God relate to me? Luke's the gospel that you want to share. Listen, read Luke. Because I think he presents it in such a unique fashion. It's not the same old stuff. It's got a lot. By the way, he includes almost all of Mark in his book. All of it. If you went through and just colored in, and you can order one of those that's got Mark, and then you go to Luke and it's color coded to show you Mark. He almost word for word got all of the Gospel of Mark in his book, but there's so much in there you wouldn't want to miss. I want to encourage you to read Luke. Any questions?
Hey, this is just kind of side thing. So it sounds like Mary's sister was named Mary too? What's up with that?
That's what it says.
No.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's kind of what it
No,
says.
her brother's daughter.
No.
It says Jesus, the mother, who is Mary, and his mother's sister, Mary.
His mother's sister.
Yeah, well, his mother was Mary, the mother of
I
Jesus.
guess it would be, yeah.
They just couldn't think of another name. Mary, let's just go with that.
Ask George Foreman about that.
I never read that before.
He named all his kids George, did he?
Yeah, he did.
Yeah, that's good. I never